As the Baroness slowly paced around the remains of the grove, Ines ruminated over her statement. The idea that some unknown threat might eventually come to attack the Sorceress Kingdom was unsettling, but the evidence left behind suggested that it would not be a true danger to them. What he dwelled upon was Baroness Saradnik's assessment of the Sorceress Kingdom, its policies, and where she thought they might lead. Hers was a vision of the future, one that Ines could not conceive of or bring to fruition through his meager efforts alone. He didn't even know where to start. Compared to his previous existence of helpless drudgery in a dead world, this new world was a paradise. Having only resided here for a mere year and a half, Ines did not have the expectations from which the hopes of the local populations possessed. Thus, he could not see what she saw, nor could he truly imagine the future that any of the locals might want. To be certain, he had his priorities. Most of his firm decisions rose from a desire to protect the memory of his friends. When it came to the future of the Sorceress Kingdom and its subjects, however, all he could do was play the part of a wise ruler and pray that his subordinates could figure out what to do with his vague directions. Ines felt that he did better when working out on the field, so to speak, interacting with individuals on a personal level and using his experience in sales to connect with people. It worked with what one might consider common folk, and he had secured several victories when it came to them, along with his few working initiatives. His interactions with aristocrats, however, had been rather uninspiring thus far. Jerknev, despite being a friend, avoided him for some reason. The nobles of Riestais had snubbed him so hard that they didn't even send a representative to contact the mysterious magic caster that had thrown in his lot with the Empire. Despite becoming an official nation, there were no foreign ambassadors present in the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Erantl's local leaders were respectful and accommodating, but he couldn't say he had really gotten to know any of them. With Baroness Saradnik came his chance to finally score a win, and due to the strange circumstances that accompanied their meeting, he thought that he had a basic feel for her character. As she slowly regained her composure, however, well, if he were to describe the Baroness in a word, it would be daunting. Behind her austere and intimidating noble's mask was everything that the man behind the mask of the Sorcerer King was not. Despite her age, she was a born leader with a vision and a plan in motion, driven by unwavering conviction and adamantine will. She worked through her doubts, fears and problems at an enviable pace. He doubted that even Albert could come up with anything serious to hold against her. So this place, he worked some regal poise into his voice, or rather, what it used to be, matches what you imagine the future of the Sorcerer's Kingdom will look like. It is difficult for me to think otherwise, Your Majesty, she replied. They were secure in their defenses. Their land and geographical position were ideal. Add inspired leadership, careful management, and motivated subjects and you have a recipe for spectacular success. The Sorcerer's Kingdom is already on that same course. I walk the streets of Erantl occasionally, Ines said, but, as you might imagine, personally figuring out whether the citizens are motivated or not as the sovereign can be difficult. Do you truly believe this to be the case? It's barely been half a year since the duchy changed hands. I cannot speak for the territories that I'm not familiar with, but the people understand that they are in a much better situation than before. It is not a difficult thing to grasp when the lands are secure, crime is next to non-existent and food is plentiful. Those living in the lands of nobles who have capitalized on our new reality are reaping the benefits and willing to believe in an even better future. Ines supposed that the numbers on Albedo's reports did reflect what she said, but it was difficult to internalize through reports alone. By scanning through them, one could see that nothing was wrong, but they didn't indicate how much better it was compared to before and how public sentiment was affected. In other words, the numbers were meaningless to him. Do you believe we'll have something like this university soon? Universal education, perhaps? Probably not in the form of this monstrosity of a building, the Baroness said, but my domain should have something like a fully fledged university in a generation or two. I already have universal education in my territory. That part was simple. The claim for a university was impressive, but he frowned at the latter. The reported literacy rate for Riestais was extremely low and was one of the problems Yuri Alpha had pointed out to him as critical to the development of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Even with her orphanage offering free education to the city folk, teaching the majority of Erantl how to read was a distant dream. Universal education was simple? Baroness Saradnik seemed to pick up on the source of his doubtful words. She turned away and smiled slightly. I was able to cheat on that front, she said. My territory was effectively empty in the spring, and I only brought in as many people as my social and economic infrastructure could sustain. The entire population should have basic literacy by the end of next year, while children attending school are further educated in preparation for vocational programs. Is there some system that you modeled yours off of? It's based on what is done in the theocracy, the Baroness replied. There are notable differences, however. The shortage of temple staff in the Sorceress Kingdom means that the bulk of our curriculum is handled by instructors trained by Miss Alpha rather than members of the clergy. Miss Alpha? You mean Yuri? Yes, Your Majesty. Several nobles have expressed interest in her work. There's quite a long waiting list for new instructors now. He was aware of Yuri's intent to employ widows and he had pledged Nazarik's full support in her efforts, but he wasn't aware what the shape that those efforts took beyond an orphanage in the city. Yameko's daughter had certainly inherited her mother's fiery passion for social welfare and education. The two shadow demons returned for another round of reports, after which the Baroness seemed satisfied that they had covered the entire floor. She dusted off her hands and knees before leading them down the largest thoroughfare leading out of the plaza. Was there anything of particular interest in here that we might have missed, Your Majesty? Something like an underground area, perhaps? The shadow demons didn't find anything that looked like it might be a way down. Then where are we headed? If this was a public space, she explained, then this should be the way out, at least that's what I was thinking. There's no reason to not have an entrance on the ground floor as a civilian structure. That there was something like a main entrance became apparent as they approached the wall. Ainz's gaze traced the outline of a doorway roughly as wide as the route that they had followed. The Baroness and her shadow demons checked all along the nearby walls and in the rooms nearby, but couldn't find a way to open it. I have no idea what I'm even looking for, she said. Is this doorway magical? My arcane vision doesn't suggest anything of the sort, he replied. There was no damage on the outside and nothing in front of us. Maybe it's just run down? Shall I force it open, Einsummer? Shiltir offered. Let's not accidentally break anything just yet, Eins told Shiltir. We have some rogues nearby. He contacted Cocytus and asked him to send the closest search team over. Within 10 minutes, an 8-edged assassin crawled down from the wall. Check for any devices that may open this wall, he ordered. Call us over if you find anything. The arachnoid mercenary NPC bobbed its head in acknowledgement and skittered off. While they waited, the rest of its team arrived. Eins sent them off to begin mapping the layout of the colossal structure. The 8-edged assassin returned shortly after, bringing them to a room nearby. It tapped one of its razor-sharp legs on a featureless section of the building's wall. Everyone leaned in to take a closer look. I don't see anything, the Baroness said, and the two shadow demons beside her shrugged. I don't see anything, either, Shiltir added. There was no mana emanating from the spot that the 8-edged assassin indicated, and there was nothing to distinguish it from the rest of the wall. How does it work? Eins asked. Just a moment, please. The 8-edged assassin brought its 4 front legs forward as it started working on some mechanism undetectable to the rest of them. Several seconds later, a handle seamlessly emerged from the wall. Turning this handle 90 degrees will activate the mechanism that opens the door, it explained. That's it? There are no traps or locks? None, Great Master. How does it know that just by looking at a featureless wall? He puzzled over the thought briefly, then decided it was a good thing that the device was unprotected. 8-edged assassins were specialized in stealthy combat, which included strong detection ability, but they were ill-suited for dealing with locks and traps. Then, unable to restrain the urge to do it himself, Eins reached out and turned the handle. By the time he went back outside, the door was already open. I didn't even hear anything. I don't think there was anything to hear, Your Majesty. The stone door was 20 meters wide, 5 meters tall, and 3 meters thick. Yet, it hadn't made a sound as it split into 2 halves and opened outwards. Even the dwarves don't have anything like this, Baroness Zaradnik remarked. They do, he told her. Though it was only a tenth of the size, the door to the royal vault in Fioburkana had a similar mechanism. A thought occurred to him. He turned to the 8-edged assassin. Search every millimeter of this door, he ordered. Report any markings or writing that you find. Ainz stepped through the entrance, running a bony hand over one of the massive doors as he made his way out. What are the chances? He murmured. Something to do with the dwarves, Your Majesty? Yes, he replied. Like this stone tower, the royal vault in Feoburkana is extraordinarily strong, strong enough to be impervious to both the demon gods that attacked the dwarf kingdom 2 centuries ago and the ancient frost dragon that moved in afterwards. Many of the contents within had been there since the golden age of runecrafting. The vault itself was protected by runes. You're saying that the dwarves might have been hired to construct this tower? The door, at least. The dwarf kingdom used to trade with a huge human nation that once existed all around the Azalisia Mountains back then. There were mounds of gold coins from that human nation within the vault. Baroness Zaradnik's steps slowed, and a furrow formed on her brow. This is the second time I've heard this, she said. Dame Verilyn told me the same thing, but her information was from the records left in the ruins of Feoburkana. I thought she was somehow mistaken in her reading, that she matched up the wrong dates or something. Mistaken? Yes, because it doesn't correspond to what I've learned of history. How long ago was the golden age of runecrafting, Your Majesty? When did it begin? A troubled expression came over the Baroness, and Ainz wondered why it troubled her so. As she had noted, the accounts of history were often flavored with the agendas and biases of each respective nation. One more conflicting tale shouldn't have mattered any more or less to one that understood this. I'm not certain, Ainz said. All I can say is that it was before the fall of Feoburkana. You can hardly call it a golden age if your capital lies in ruins and your nation is in decline. Dwarves live for centuries, so what they call an age may be a very long time indeed. I see, the young noblewoman seemed to relax. I was probably too narrow-minded in my thinking. I thought it went against the history I knew, but in reality, this human nation that the dwarf kingdom traded with might have existed long before humanity was driven into a corner. History can be complicated, he smirked. Especially in this region where very little beyond the last 2 centuries has survived. Even what comes from before mostly consists of tales from the world beyond. I believe that Momon's observations about the history of this region should be kept in mind not only for your investigation here, but for any accounts of history that you delve into. The Baroness' troubled look returned. After leaving the ruined tower, the Sorcerer King had them stop by the Royal Army headquarters to see if anything new had been uncovered around the city ruins. Despite their meticulous work and the extraordinary perception of the 8-edge assassins, however, the rest of the place remained an unremarkable collection of rubble. His Majesty seemed to take the information, or lack of it, in stride. Ludmilla sensed that, after investigating the colossal tower, he was now set on exploring the capital to the south in hopes of finding something even more substantial. As they made their way back to where her vessel was moored on the river, Ludmilla mulled over the words of Momon, conveyed to her by the Sorcerer King. The history that is agreed upon. The history that is disagreed upon. The history that people do not believe matters. It was a neatly packaged way of describing a process through which one might wade through the mire of history to arrive at the truth. As it was, however, she felt that she was getting nowhere. At first, she was something that bordered on being offended when confronted with other accounts of history that conflicted with what she had learned. Be it from temple histories, local law, or her independent research, everything was a history that was agreed upon. Ilishnisha's account of the Dwarven records was the first time that Ludmilla had ever heard otherwise. The Sorcerer King's related account of the dwarves' past brought that conflict back into her awareness. Her attempts at making sense of Katza's history with so little to go off of only caused her to draw the anomalous information back into her cross-examination of the history that she knew. At one point, Ludmilla thought she had realized a way to reconcile everything, but the Sorcerer King seemed to insist that she continue scrutinizing events. A wall existed in the region's history, as His Majesty had noted. It was one where local records ceased to be beyond the time 2 centuries previous to their own. Though history was a mystery past this point, the reason for it was well known. The demon gods had destroyed nearly all of the nations that existed in the region, perhaps even beyond it. Only 2 places survived intact, that she knew of. The first was the slain theocracy. The second was the Elven Kingdom in the Great Forest of Evanser, who had been the theocracy's ally until recent times. She supposed that there was also what the Frost Dragons and Frost Giants knew, but it was difficult to discern truth from boast in any of their tales, and their accounts centered on their high mountain home. The temple histories understandably only spoke of the theocracy's history as the sole remaining bastion of humanity. There was no history in the time between the advent of the 6 great gods and the demon gods, as far as human knowledge was concerned, because they were not human lands until the demon gods wrought calamity upon them. After the demon gods were vanquished by the 13 heroes, the theocracy sent great numbers of their people to seed the lands left ruined in the aftermath. Every human nation in the north owed its founding to this effort. With this being the case, her thoughts went further back in time, to when humanity still existed beyond their little corner of the world. Humans must have had nations before that, and she saw the one that they were currently investigating as an example of this. Perhaps those that managed to escape the destruction fled to the area where the theocracy now stood, potentially making them the ancestors of many humans in the present day. Carrying this thought in her heart, waves of dull anger followed her wherever she went. What would humanity be like if they hadn't lost everything to the cruel realities of a world that was intent on destroying them? All that they struggled with today must have surely been a trivial matter to the humans of the past. Ludmilla glanced over her shoulder, to where the Sorcerer King and Lady Shaltir followed in the wake of her company. Was this excursion truly happenstance? Sursana was not only the god of death, but held purview over judgment and justice. This was the reason why noble families that followed the 6 tended to be Sursana adherents, House Zaradnik and House Corlin included. It was almost certain that a great injustice had occurred here, perhaps a great reckoning was finally in the works. Once the architect of this great atrocity was unveiled, judgment would surely come, no matter how far away they were. Upon reaching the river harbor, Ludmilla activated her Frostburn Phoenix hairpin, flying over to alight on the deck of her ship. She turned to speak to one of the vampire brides who were making ready for the Sorcerer King's arrival. "Has anything happened while we were away?" "It's been quiet the entire time," the vampire bride replied. "Quite relaxing, actually." Ludmilla made her rounds, inspecting her vessel and its surroundings. Nothing appeared to be amiss, though there was also no reason to suspect that anything would. She gave the all-clear to Lady Shaltir, who arrived with His Majesty shortly after. A few minutes later, they were on their way south, propelled by the river and the north wind. At their current speed, it would take perhaps 3 hours to draw close to their destination. The soft sound of luxurious robes whispered over the deck. At her usual spot on the bow, Ludmilla turned to find the Sorcerer King standing behind her. Lady Shaltir stood on his right side, though as his escort her focus was directed towards their surroundings. "It shouldn't be a long trip, I think." "No more than 3 hours, Your Majesty." Ludmilla tamped down on the pleasant warmth that rose in His Majesty's presence. "Considering where we're headed, it may be prudent to slow down before then in case there are hazards below the surface." "Hazards? I suppose I should dominate a few wraiths and send them ahead of us underwater." "A prudent decision," she nodded. "I've been worrying if there are any wrecks on the riverbed. That city had an expansive harbor, but I didn't see any ships." Considering the fact that much of everything had been burned away, the vessels in those harbors might have been as well. Still, there should have been more than a few navigating the river that had been sunk. "Speaking of ships," the Sorcerer King said, "there are rumors of one that wanders the plains. Have you heard anything about this, Lady Zaradnik?" "Not that I can recall, Your Majesty. I am probably one of the worst people to ask, however, most of my time is spent focused on my duties rather than frequenting places where tales and rumors collect." "I see. At any rate, I had hoped we would have encountered it by now. Since we were close to the center of the region, there should have been elder liches and the like, especially in that mage tower. The red skeleton warriors in the city were about as strong as a weak elder lich, so Ludmilla had expected something like that as well." She stepped over to stand on the Sorcerer King's left so that she wouldn't block the view or make him talk to her back when she faced forward again. "The concentration of negative energy increases the closer we get to the capital." She looked out over the water, "so the undead accumulating there should reach higher levels. This means that we have a greater chance of meeting an elder lich, yes?" Lady Shaltir tilted her head curiously. "The concentration of negative energy?" "Yes, my lady." A long silence stretched out between them. The Sorcerer King cleared his throat. "I think what Shaltir is asking is how you've determined this, Lady Zaradnik." Is it the intangible sense for undead and undead-producing locations that all creatures appear to possess? You can't see it, my lady? No? Ludmilla leaned forward to look at Lady Shiltir on the other side of the Sorcerer King. She returned Ludmilla's look with a shake of her head. But I thought all undead could sense negative energy as I did, Ludmilla said. That is certainly not the case, His Majesty said. You mentioned that you see it. Most do not perceive negative energy in such a direct way unless they're in the process of being blasted by it. I don't think I have a proper way to express my perception, Ludmilla replied. It's like a sixth sense that ties in with my other senses. Even if I close my eyes, I can perceive it. When combined with my true sight, it can pierce any attempts to conceal negative energy in the same way as my talent can pierce illusions and supernatural subterfuge. Do you have some race-specific behavior related to negative energy, an ability or a skill? She fell silent, trying to figure out how to describe what she did. How it even worked was something she was still trying to figure out. I'm still trying to understand what it is, exactly, she said. When I was investigating it in my territory, I found that negative energy is attracted to me. What happens when it reaches you? I think I absorb it, Ludmilla replied. I can feel the emotions it carries when I do. Sometimes, I react badly to a particularly distasteful patch of negative energy. Now that she was thinking about it, her recollection drew forth other details. So you're like a vampire, Lady Shiltir said, except instead of blood, it's negative energy? This feeling you describe is similar to what I taste when I drink blood. Your guess is as good as mine, my lady. Wait, His Majesty said something earlier, that vampires have an enhanced sense of hearing and smell that helps them track their prey. That's right, the Sorcerer King nodded. What of it? They're basically racial traits? Natural tools that help them locate their food. Do Elder Liches have the same arcane vision that your Majesty possesses? Yes, his voice turned tentative. It is an ability that all Elder Liches have. It's said that Elder Liches grow in power by absorbing mana, she explained. If you look at it from the same perspective, arcane vision is a racial trait that helps them locate their food. It made a sort of sense to her, at least. Her background as a ranger may have been influencing things, however. All living creatures had the tools to secure their sustenance, so why not undead? So while I've been feeding on you, Lady Shiltir smiled lasciviously, you've been secretly feeding on me? Yet another of your clinky behaviors has come to light. It only works on ambient negative energy, that I've seen. I don't hover around the Death Knights in my domain like some giant negative energy mosquito. So you say, her liege said teasingly. Between them, the Sorcerer King cleared his throat. Does that mean you've been absorbing negative energy since we crossed into the Katza Plains? No, Your Majesty, Ludmilla shook her head. I can't say for certain, but it only appears to work in the territories under my control. I was testing out this ability in the Erantal Cemetery before Lady Shiltir contacted me about your plans for an excursion. The negative energy there avoided me. Also, pardon me, Your Majesty. Ludmilla unequipped her gauntlets. She leaned forward to hold out her palm, trying to present it edgewise to the Sorcerer King. I'm not sure if you can see it, she said. But this unnatural Katza mist is steeped in negative energy. His Majesty leaned forward. Ludmilla's stomach fluttered when she realized how close his face was getting to her hand. Yes, I see it. The mist is moving to barely avoid your hand. That's quite interesting. So what do you get from feeding on the negative energy in your domain? He leaned back again, and Ludmilla quickly withdrew her hand. Ambient negative energy isn't expended when an undead being manifests from it, she said, so a strong enough patch will continue manifesting undead once in a while. The temples suppress the negative energy in the Erantal Cemetery, but, as you know, undead will still appear there. Nature, however, can counteract the accumulation of negative energy. They say that nature spirits manifest when a natural environment becomes old or rich enough, and after gaining my ability to perceive negative energy, I think this is true. So something like an abundance of life energy. I believe Pinison, a dryad that we met in the Great Forest of Tob, manifested in the way that you describe. Yes, Your Majesty. Elementals are also said to manifest the same way, in places abundant with their associated elemental energies. My ability to absorb negative energy removes it from where it was entirely, so you might say that I get a cleaner domain. I don't know if this also means that life energy will become more abundant in my territory because there's no negative energy to counteract it. I suppose if nature spirits will start popping up all over the place if I keep things neat and tidy, I'll know for sure. Instead of a revenant, Lady Shiltier quipped, we should call you a death maid. Believe it or not, my lady, Ludmilla smirked, the same thought crossed my mind while I was learning about it. What about personal benefits? The Sorcerer King asked. Shiltier, for instance, can use collected blood to fuel metamagic. There's also her blood frenzy. Has she mentioned that to you before? Rather than a personal benefit, Lady Shiltier considered it a sort of curse. Ludmilla had been warned of its existence as a precaution shortly after she started offering Lady Shiltier her blood. If too much blood was spilt on her skin, she would enter a berserk state. Yes, Your Majesty. I don't sense that I can do anything with what I absorb. I'm not even sure where it goes. I wonder if there's a way to find out if you grow like an elder lich. Perhaps through the generation of mass amounts of ambient negative energy in your territory. There was a conflict in the upper reaches a few months ago, she replied. I got around to cleaning it up recently, but I'm not sure if I gained anything from it. The Sorcerer King raised a hand to his chin thoughtfully. You say that you can only absorb negative energy in your territory, he said in musing tones. Since we're taking over the Katza Plains, I could grant you some land. Once you're done cleaning it up, we could exchange it for another uncleansed territory. If it works, it would mean a lot more arable land for the Sorceress Kingdom. I will make the attempt if you wish, Your Majesty, Ludmilla said. But something tells me it isn't as simple as that. If it was, the Sorceress Kingdom could lease me out to clean up graveyards and old battlefields around the world for a hefty sum. A deep chuckle rose from His Majesty's throat. That does sound rather silly when you put it that way, he said. I suppose not everything can be so easily investigated. At least you seem to have embraced your role as a custodian of your territory. A warden. Some of the demi-humans in my territory seem to understand what I am, or rather, my place in the grand scheme of things. They've been calling me the Warden of the Vale long before I rose as a revenant. Dame Verilyn seems to know something about it as well, but... Several wraiths floated over to the bow of the ship, lining up in front of the Sorcerer King. His Majesty nodded several times before their sail was lowered and the skeletal oarsmen worked to slow down the ship. Ludmilla walked forward and scanned the surface of the water ahead, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. They found something? She asked. Those hazards you were wary of, the Sorcerer King answered. The river bottom is littered with the remains of large ships for the next dozen or so kilometers. The desperate struggle carved into the silent stone halls of the ancient university rose fresh from her memory. It appeared that they were about to uncover yet another chapter of Katza's tragic past. They anchored a few hundred meters from where the underwater hazards were supposedly lurking just beneath the surface. Ludmilla frowned out over the river, searching for the telltale signs in the current that indicated submerged objects like rocks or logs. If you want to go for a swim, Lady Shiltier said, go right on ahead. I don't want to get silt and mud on this precious equipment. Then just take it all off, her liege smiled. In fact, I'd prefer it that way. Ludmilla eyed the back of the Sorcerer King, who had walked up to gaze out over the end of the bow. The fingers clasped behind him twitched. Had they gotten a reaction out of His Majesty? The Sorcerer King nearly always carried himself with regal poise and grace. It made the rare times that his raw feelings slipped out especially endearing, precious moments to be quietly cherished in her memory. Ludmilla briefly imagined herself stripping in front of him before she caught herself. That's inappropriate, my lady. In front of them, the Sorcerer King seemed to nod to himself. It's just us here, Lady Shiltier said. Well, if you're that shy, how about swimming around in just the bodysuit? His Majesty turned around. Won't it be unequipped with the rest of the armor? The individual pieces may still be removed by hand, Lord Ines. That seems like a hassle, the Sorcerer King said. She doesn't have usable clothing under her armor? Under my armor? Ludmilla frowned. A long silence passed between them. The crimson points of His Majesty's eyes drifted over Ludmilla. Half of her wanted his gaze to linger, while the other half urged her to cringe away. His gaze slid over to Lady Shiltier. Shiltier. Why yes, Lord Ines? I'm fairly certain there was a clothing slot item listed in this equipment set. Yes, YKH-07. So then it should be no problem, yes? Lady Shiltir opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her brows drew together in an expression of great concentration before her face relaxed into a smile. It brought to mind the look of a farmer showing off their prize animal. Ludmilla, she said imperiously. His Majesty desires that you unequip your armor. Wait. His Majesty cut in, what exactly is YKH-07? It's, important. Yes, important equipment for ladies of our means. The Sorcerer King turned to Ludmilla. Lady Zaradnik, he asked, what is it? They're pads, your Majesty. And? That's it. After the answer left her mouth, Ludmilla wanted to jump into the river, armor and all. You could have used something better to wear under her armor, the Sorcerer King said. But it's how Lord Peroncino made it. Lady Shiltir protested, then turned to Ludmilla. You like it, don't you? Wearing next to nothing under your armor, it's exciting. It wasn't that particular aspect of the equipment that she liked. Lady Shiltir showed her how to use them with her regular clothing, so Ludmilla had planned on doing just that. Its enchantments wouldn't stack with the effects of enchanted clothing that was already there, but that was beside the point. As Lady Shiltir had so delicately put it, it was important equipment for ladies of their means. The scales of her judgment teetered back and forth. She would have to return them if they were replaced with something else. Maybe she could have something like them made? The next time we go back, the Sorcerer King said. Have some regular undergarments made for that slot. And so the God of Judgment rendered his decision in her stead. Lady Shiltir sighed in disappointment, and His Majesty turned back to look out over the bow. I have some swimwear you could borrow, her liege offered. The Sorcerer King froze. Ludmilla frowned upon seeing His Majesty do so. Swimwear? Equipment designed to be worn in and around water, her liege told her. Would you like to take a look? I can't say I'm not just a bit curious. Something appeared in Lady Shiltir's hands. Ludmilla waited for her to start laying out pieces of equipment on the deck, but Lady Shiltir simply dangled it in front of her. Ludmilla's eyes widened in scandalized realization. My lady, that's a string. Summon Monster X. They both started as the Sorcerer King's voice boomed out over the river. The swimwear vanished from Lady Shiltir's hands. Seconds later, something stirred beneath the water. A swell formed in front of the ship, resolving into a watery face as wide as Ludmilla was tall. Move the wrecks below onto the eastern shore, His Majesty ordered. Minimize the damage to them, if possible. The face merged back into the river, leaving nothing but the flowing current behind. Several dozen seconds later, a huge object broke the surface of the water. It took a moment to realize that it was the bow of a ship. Torrents of water streamed off of its deck as it rose above the current for the first time in untold ages. Aquatic undead, rotting debris and globs of silt plopped into the water. More of the hull followed, but it abruptly ended in a jagged array of broken boards. Ludmilla thought that it must have been at least half of the vessel. The stump of a mast could be seen near the back end. Its design was distinctly different from her now, however, half again its beam with 3 times the draft. As the wreck was conveyed into the mist towards the distant riverbank, she saw that it was being cradled by what appeared to be living water. Is that a water elemental, Your Majesty? Moo, the Sorcerer King replied. It's an elemental monolith, one step down from a primal elemental. It's quite a large step, however. As he said so, 3 more broken hulls rose from the water. The elemental monoliths were powerful enough that she couldn't accurately gauge how strong they were. The size of an elemental correlated directly to its power, so adventurers described them in those terms. Small, medium, large, huge, and so on. Neither monolith nor primal was familiar to her. Shiltir, His Majesty said, summon some as well. There's an entire fleet down there to dredge up. Right away, Lord Ines. Summon Monster X. 4 more water elemental monoliths joined the first set. Your Majesty, Ludmilla asked, how strong would you say these are compared to the creature that attacked the tower that we just left? Specific properties aside, each one of these should be about the same strength as the entity that was rampaging through that building. Ludmilla's gaze followed the line of elementals carrying wreckage to the shore. Each one, the fate that befell Katza seemed an impossibility for the Sorceress Kingdom. Challenging beings of transcendental power like His Majesty and Lady Shiltir was unthinkable. Her solemn thoughts turned grave, recalling the histories of the theocracy. Their gods were not the only beings that possessed transcendental power. A mere century after the advent of the 6 great gods, the 8 greed kings had set the world aflame. After that, Ludmilla swallowed as her eyes rested on the back of His Majesty. Dread settled upon her being as she considered the past. Your Majesty. You've raised a new nation here, does that mean you are here to stay? Sudden tears blurred Ludmilla's vision. Why did he hesitate to answer? Frustration over her powerlessness welled up within her. She could do nothing if he decided to leave. She would do anything for him to stay. Not just for herself, but for the people of Erantal who had kept the faith through centuries of adversity. Beside His Majesty, Shiltir blinked and looked up at him. A rare look of fearful worry filled her face. Minutes passed before the rustle of silken fabrics sounded over the current. The hem of the Sorcerer King's robe entered her downcast gaze. There is something I would like to ask, Lady Zaradnik, he said. What is a god to you? She licked her lips nervously at the unexpected question. Why was he asking this? Was it some sort of test? They are beings of great power, Your Majesty. Far beyond that which mere mortals might obtain. His Majesty snorted. Is that all? Power? Many beings possess great power. Does that make them all gods? Ludmilla looked past His Majesty, to the elementals clearing their way. Truth be told, that was how it was. Beings of sufficient power were invariably perceived as gods who had descended upon the world. The water elemental monoliths would be considered water gods if one did not understand that they were summoned creatures. Gods were not guaranteed to be good or evil. Sometimes they were worshipped as divine benefactors. Other times, they were harbingers of calamity or simply treated as a force of nature. The demon gods were the most recent ones of note, along with the dragon god who brought the tale of the 13 heroes to an end. No matter who he claimed to be, the Sorcerer King would be seen as a god to simple beings such as herself. As would Lady Shiltir and many of the Sorcerer King's vassals. His Majesty's question confused her. It was common sense for nearly everyone, yet he seemed to have some other notion in mind. I will put it another way, the Sorcerer King said. There exist great religions that perform works in the name of their gods. The clergy of these faiths would have you believe that these gods of theirs are not simply beings of great power. Do the faithful not believe in the almighty power of their gods? That they may create or destroy on a whim? That they are omniscient, omnipresent and omnipotent? I've never heard of any god like that before, Your Majesty. Gods are certainly powerful enough to do many things, but they cannot do everything. She glanced up at His Majesty. Sometimes, people might think that the gods had answers to the problems that vexed them and prayed for miracles, but that was only wishful thinking. What he had said seemed so silly that would have treated it as a joke if not for his serious tone. He remained silent, and Ludmilla racked her memories for any knowledge that might satisfy him. All she knew of the gods, however, were what was conveyed in the scriptures. Surely he was not interested in that. Yet, she spoke anyway, desperate to produce the answer that he sought. Our scriptures are filled with the knowledge of the gods. Her voice was tentative, but they say very little about the gods themselves. Only that their advent ensured humanity's survival and that they dwelled amongst us. The gods even had children, born out of unions with human partners. More to the point, the gods were humans themselves. Except for Sursana. An uninvited thought wandered into her mind. 5 of the gods had children with the humans that they dwelled with, and traces of divine blood flowed through many in the present day. Maybe His Majesty had come to even the score? Lady Shiltir was quite confident that His Majesty could give her children. If so, what did that entail for Ludmilla, who was undead as well? Was it part of the reason why she had been allowed to return? A divine purpose? The blood of the other gods probably flowed through millions, so catching up seemed a daunting task. No, as undead, she had a limitless lifespan. Maybe she could raise a few children every other generation? 2 or 3 at a time might be nice, she murmured to herself. Huh? It's nothing, Your Majesty. She looked back down, realizing she had been staring at His Majesty for too long. It took a moment for her to gather her thoughts again. To be honest, she said, I'm not sure if I possess the answer that Your Majesty is looking for. 5 of our gods were human, and that nothing is said of their private lives suggests they lived as regular humans do. The sixth and greatest was undead, but he was not an evil god as many might believe an undead god to be. He had some pretty evil lesser gods who followed him, however. Even that part was the same. The Sorcerer King had many servants who would be seen as evil by humans. Shiltir was essentially a lesser god who served him, and she was quite proud of her evil nature. Despite her tendency to favor an evil approach to things, however, she was an excellent legion whom Ludmilla could trust and proudly serve. So in your mind, His Majesty said, a god can be ignorant, make mistakes and fail? I am not an expert on the nature of gods, Your Majesty, Ludmilla replied. But descended gods surely do all that and more. They can love and laugh and cry, feel sorrow and regret. They are people with interests of their own, and with their power, many whims and desires would surely be fulfilled. If they choose a mortal form, they can grow old and die. It is even possible for gods to be banished by other powerful beings, as the histories tell. She swallowed after the words spilt from her mouth. The last was not something that followers of the six liked to dwell upon. Merely a century following their god's advent, the 8 Greed kings arrived and committed the grave sin, forcefully taking Sursana, the merciful god who had stayed with humanity, away from them. Then they are, as you seem to put it, just powerful people. Ludmilla nodded. If that is the case, the Sorcerer King asked, why are they gods? How do these powerful beings transcend conventional recognition to become subjects of worship? It would depend on the god, Ludmilla answered. Respect, gratitude, fear, something greater than themselves. Those would probably be the common reasons. The 6 great gods represent aspects of human life. Since they were mostly humans, it is easy for us to see ourselves in them. As for worship, it does not just mean tithes, hymns and prayer. How we live our lives serves as the principal form of worship. For a noble who follows the 6, administration, leadership and the delivery of justice according to the precepts of our faith is all a form of worship. Ours is not a shallow, empty faith, it is one intertwined with every fiber of our existence. I suppose that, for one who is accustomed to their power, the notion that others might come to worship them seems strange. For us, however, they are so far above our regular lives that we cannot even grasp the furthest extent of their being. Conventional recognition, as Your Majesty puts it, cannot even grasp how strong a platinum rank adventurer is. The tales of heroes and legends utterly fail to convey the realities that come with their power. An existence far beyond even those. What else can such a being be called, but a god?